Hello everyone, this is Noor Mousa.
And this is Rachel Sider.
Welcome to Confused About Yemen.
Confused About Yemen is a three-episode series talking about one aid worker's experience living and working in Yemen and the people she encountered along the way.
The focus of today's episode is on Yemen's future. In this final episode, we are looking ahead. What does Yemen future looks like? One country, two countries, or something else entirely? And what does that mean for Yemenis who are just trying to survive the day?
Maybe before we tackle some of those big questions, we can just remind ourselves of where things stand in the country to begin with. We know that in the past several months, fighting between the Houthi rebels and the Saudi-led coalition that backs the internationally recognized government in the south has largely subsided. But at the same time, Houthis have repeatedly attacked ships that have been transiting the Red Sea, all of which is linked, of course, to the ongoing war in Gaza, which has at this moment reached a bit of a ceasefire. And that dialogue between the Houthis and the Saudis has given some hope for an eventual negotiated solution to the conflict. But we know that there's been relatively little progress been made, and occasional outbreaks and violence. I'm just going to pause and start that section over. However, we know that many of these talks have yielded few results and have been punctuated by various incidents of violence. The Southern Transitional Council, which we have seen renew calls for an independent southern Yemeni state, has made prospects for peace all the more complicated. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has continued to attack different parts of the country, which has made resolving some of these unanswered questions in Yemen, including the status of Al-Mukha, a western coastal area, all the more difficult. At the same time, as two humanitarian aid workers, we're largely concerned with the humanitarian situation in the country, which has unfortunately not improved during this period. 21.6 million people are in need of aid, including 11 million children, and more than 4.5 million people are displaced. Talks to end the war are currently on hold, and aid and development efforts in the country continue to be frustrated by escalations in violence, US sanctions, and a crackdown by the Houthis on the work of international and national organizations. So, Noor, that was pretty grim. We know that there are a lot of challenges that continue to face Yemen and the Yemeni people. And when we think about Yemen's future in the country and in the diplomatic spaces, what are some of the options for the future that you're hearing from colleagues, from friends, and from others that you got to interact with during your time there? Is it separation between the North and the South? Is it a united country? What are we hearing?
So it is mainly around these two solutions or propositions is either we go back to prior to the unification or we unify. Prior to the unification, there were two Yemens, and people in the south unified with the north, and it became the Yemen we know. But there are some people in the south who think that wasn't the ideal decision for the people in the south, and so they are pro separation. And those who are pro one country, they have connections across the whole country. They see themselves as one nation, and there are multiple reasons to be one country. There are internal reasons, and there are also external reasons. There are other countries who don't want to deal with two Yemens, two separate countries. They want to deal with one country, one government. I think the biggest challenge, as anybody would suspect, is who's going to rule this country. And that's the main challenge in Yemen now. Yemen is, as we've said before, is extremely divided between different control areas, and the majority of control is under Ansarullah, the Houthis in the north. And what does that mean for the smaller groups? Even when unification happened in the south between different groups through the STC, what does that mean when there is a larger group that is mainly being opposite, like that is mainly being rejected by the other groups? So unification and or remaining as one Yemen, it's extremely challenged by that political dynamic, and obviously the consequences of the conflict and the borders and the front lines and all of that. Now, the separation is also will be challenged by major powers who see that they could control the whole country. And so it remains a question not about which is better for Yemenis, but what these political elites think is better for them and for their control of the areas they are already control, or extending that control to further parts of Yemen. But in these two options, sometimes you think, and you hear from Yemenis also, maybe there is another option. I haven't heard what is that other option, but the hope of maybe there is another option for many people stems from knowing these challenges, knowing how difficult it is to separate again or to stay together. And the third the third option is already the reality of Yemen now. Like what is happening now is not a separation nor one country. So maybe this is the third option, but also many people discuss these options because they don't think this is the option. So maybe there is a fourth option. We really don't know. It's very challenging to understand these options because they are on different levels. What do the Yemenis prefer? We don't know. You cannot understand what Yemenis know. There are no channels and platforms for them to express their opinions, referendums, ways for them to interact on that questions and share their preference. On political level, what these powers inside Yemen think is the best and agree on and could agree on. Is there an option that they could actually all agree on? And also, as I said, regionally and globally, what does these big countries who interact with the conflict in Yemen think is better for them when they are making that decision on which side they should separate or which solution they should be on? So there are all these challenges. But for people, and when you speak to Yemenis, for them, it should, inshallah, it will be figured out one day. But what I need is services to go back to my place when they are displaced, education, to be able to travel, to be able to seek medical treatment. This is what Yemenis want, is peace. They want economic opportunities. They want their rights and dignity to be respected. Sorry, should I just continue on legitimacy or not yet? Okay. But the argument on legitimacy of these actors in Yemen is taking over all of this conversation. The conversation on peace and solutions is always changes direction toward, but who has legitimacy? Who should be on the table and be making that decision? And it's very difficult to say this or that in Yemen because all the different parts of the political process in Yemen, because all the different actors have some legitimacy. They are either been part of the government before, or were in the government before, and they had to shift their location. They either been actually discriminated against and weren't included in the country, and they were used by the government in a way that they feel like, I'm finally in power, I'm protecting my people, and I'm not giving that power away. So there is an argument to each side, but with the years, each side managed to also build its own groups and assets, infrastructure, and it's very difficult also for them now to let go of these people and tell them it's okay, now I can give control to someone else. But these people feel like it might not be safe for me. I might be discriminated against when this other side comes and take power. So it's very challenging also for these group leaders to let go of some of that power. And you hear it also among them when they talk about each other. So you attend events or you read the news, and the vocabulary or they use to describe the different side. It's sometimes very interesting because legitimacy is always part of that vocabulary. They are not legitimate. They are not legitimate. The South says the North is not legitimate. They haven't been elected. They just took power. The North says the South is not legitimate. We've took power. There haven't been election for so many years. What makes them a government? And then you have the international community giving legitimacy to one side, while this side say they know they are, and they've been described as the internationally recognized government. They see these same countries who recognize them as a country interact in the north with the authorities there. And so that's very confusing also for them. That's very challenging for them. And so it's just not only internally there is this divide, but also how the world interact with Yemen and these different groups is also feeding into that legitimacy question.
There's something really powerful in what you're saying, Noor, which is around who represents Yemenis in these various processes, right? Around national dialogue, around brokering a ceasefire to begin with, and around laying out some of the foundations for hopefully a more long-lasting and durable peace. And a lot of those questions around representation then feed into how these delegations are seen as legitimate or not, and the trust that Yemenis have in the process that they then undertake, and what that means then in terms of the sustainability of the outcomes that they might reach. And as someone who's sitting in Geneva, these are all very big questions that a lot of peace-building organizations are really dealing with. And we see this coming through as well in the disconnect that often exists between elite-driven processes, those who represent some of the more senior or the highest blood-shedding factions in a war earn a seat at the table, right? But whether that seat at the table is legitimate or not, and whether it translates into an outcome that's good for your average Yemeni is still to be defined. And Yemen is, I think, one of these very clear examples of where getting that dynamic right between representation, inclusion, and the process that structures those different interests and dynamics being really crucial.
Yes, and we forgot also to touch upon different different priorities for Yemenis that also interact with that legitimacy question. So it's the legitimacy of these actors among their own people. The Yemenis are struggling economically while they see that these elites are able to travel, they have better living conditions themselves, they are engaged in investment projects. So you see this, when you meet Yemenis and when you read the news, corruption comes up in Yemen as an issue that people perceive that those who represent them might be engaged with, and that impact trust and make people feel that it's very difficult for change to happen because these elites are not experiencing what we are experiencing. They are not seeing how difficult it is for us to survive by the day. So for them, it's fine if this process takes long. So that's one side of it. And then the voices of people and how reflected they are in this process is also lacking. You see, it's mainly, when you read about the negotiation news, it's mainly a meeting between Houthis and Ansar Allah with Saudi Arabia, worked by another country, Oman, different diplomatic missions. But where are the Yemenis, the normal Yemenis, the Yemenis who are impacted by the war, the displaced, the women, the youth? And for people in the South, sometimes they question where are the voices of our own representation in there? Why are the meetings are mainly happening between the North and Saudi Arabia? How about us in the South? And you see that sometimes being asked. So that's also impact the trust in representation in these conversations, and in the formulation also of like what do you call them, of coalitions, sorry, and the formulation of coalitions in Yemen. You see it as people don't understand how these groups who were fighting each other are able to unify themselves, and for this political reason, how can they trust them? Because they were fighting each other before, and they still publicly accuse each other of different crimes or corruption or involvement with Al Qaeda or different group, but they sit on the same table, so they don't know how to trust them. And as I said, corruption as well, but then also people cannot trust a country where, not in the South, mainly in the North, the country where there is lack of freedom to express, to protest, to self-organize, to post on social media, where journalists are being imprisoned, but where you see people who had worked before with diplomatic missions are being accused with serious crimes. So for many people, they think, how can we trust those who are representing us where we don't know much about what is happening? And those who want to talk about this is trust issue, or about of our participation, are being taken to prison. So that's a very serious point to take in consideration when we talk about the solutions. Is, do Yemenis trust the process and those who represent them? And are there foundations to that trust, or these are also being challenged?
Another layer of this too is also the role of the UN, right? And very often in these situations, a UN mediated inclusive dialogue is crucial and is often been seen as the most legitimate of processes, right? Because of the unique function that the United Nations plays as a multilateral institution. But we're in an era where the credibility of the UN has been thrown into question, and where its own effectiveness when it comes to supporting comprehensive peace agreements is failing. And I'd be curious to hear from you, Noor, around how the UN and its function is perceived among Yemenis, particularly as we think about the dialogue and the wider peace process that it has been mandated to support.
So there are special missions to Yemen. You have the special envoy, and then you have the humanitarian coordinator, the resident coordinator. And when it comes to Yemenis, most of them, they know the UN from its programming in the field and camps and the small projects here and there. But when it comes to politicians, they know the two sides. We go to them for the programming, and then also about the peace process and the human rights system in the country and what happens here and there. So in Yemen, it's very challenging for the UN. It's not easy for them to operate there. It's not easy for anyone to operate there, especially the Yemen with that dual work. And when it comes to political engagement, it's the UN usually, and there are reasons, there are valid reasons to perceive them in that way, but there are also, it's not the right way to perceive the UN is the wrong way actually to perceive the UN. They are being perceived mainly as a political actor and mainly as a Western actor because they're based in New York. It's mainly when a Yemeni meets a UN special envoy or a UN humanitarian coordinator, they are mainly Western men, white Western men. So, of course, they would make these associations that there is a political dynamic here. And it's not really seen as a mission that is here to help Yemen realizing peace. So I would say from the way we saw it as NGOs, how the UN is being interacted with by these different groups, the South leans more towards the UN because they are internationally recognized. This is how the UN interact with them. They try to always advocate for them to have a seat on the conversation around peace. But in the North, it's not the same at all. Again, the humanitarian coordinator is always from certain countries. They mainly meet with high-level officials so that they are seen to be there for a political reason. And sometimes they are not even allowed there. And then when something happen in the country, so for example, sanctions by the US or a statement by a Western state on Yemen, the humanitarian coordinator or the special envoy are the ones who receive the blame for it or are the ones who get the interaction from the authorities in the North on it. So they are treated in a very political way, which is impacting the way they could actually do their job. They are there, they know their role, they know what they need to do there, but they are being dragged to engage with issues that are not connected to their work. They need to justify what states have said while they are there to help procure peace or improve the humanitarian condition in the country. So it's very challenging for the UN in Yemen. And what makes it also challenging is the lack of diplomatic missions for many reasons. But at least in the South, safety could be a barrier, but there are obviously the travel and there are so many barriers. But at least in the South, the few months I was in Yemen working there, the only interaction we had with diplomats, it was either when we traveled to Amman and there is a meeting around the humanitarian situation in Yemen, or when they visit to speak to the UN and to us. And this happens rarely, like maybe once or twice a year, the mission come to Yemen. So the lack of diplomatic missions makes not only the UN, even NGOs are the face of a certain government in the country. So you find yourself having to write talking points for your country director on, like, if they ask us about what did this government do, we say we're an NGO, we don't represent this government, and this is what we do. And we don't face this in many countries, but in Yemen, because of the lack of the diplomatic missions, it could be one of the reasons, not because of it, but it's one of the main reasons that the UN is playing a bigger role, a role not that they chose for themselves, but it's been imposed on them. So I would say it's very challenging for them. And it's very challenging as well with the selections of the representation they have in there. When I was there were two senior positions that have been filled again. And interactions with other advocacy colleagues, they were worried who are the replacements. And a Yemeni colleague said, of course, it's going to be a British man. And it was. So that was a Yemeni colleague who said that. What do we think the government said when they keep seeing the same profiles coming to the country to engage with them?
I think what you're also describing is that the absence of a political solution or a peaceful solution to the conflict is only perpetuating humanitarian needs and making the role of some of the humanitarian organizations that you've just described all the more crucial, but also all the more protracted, right? And that the absence of a peaceful solution inhibits larger scale investment in the country that could lead to the rehabilitation and repair of road networks and healthcare facilities and schools and other critical infrastructure, and is a real barrier to Yemen rebuilding and recovering from over a decade of war. And it also means that people's lives are really in limbo until some of these bigger efforts can be made and made successfully, right? And I'd be interested in hearing, therefore, a little bit around what's the latest in terms of where the peace talks stand. What are the prospects for ending the war? And what does this mean for everyday Yemenis who are counting on some of these processes, but as we've said, don't necessarily feel that they are represented or seen throughout them?
For Yemenis, first of all, there are multiple barriers for them to actually understand what is happening. As we spoke before, freedom of speech is a bit challenged in Yemen, so media cannot be that free in sharing what is happening. Even us internationals in there, we're always challenged by the lack of transparency on the meetings that are taking place, the agenda on there, what are the challenges, barriers, where is the disagreement, who wants what. Sometimes you get to hear about it from a statement, and sometimes you don't know what happened. So I think for many Yemenis, they don't even know what is happening. They know what we know from media. And that's a challenge by itself. How do they know what the future holds for them, how to interact with these conversations if they don't know what is taking place? Second, and I say this with all confidence, like many other populations who went through conflict, ordinary people always think about their survival and their lives. Despite the political disagreements and how things will go, they do care. They want things to move forward. But what they need more is to go back to their areas if they are displaced, to know if they should invest in where they are now or in their areas of origin, just to know if basic services will be restored, if their rights will be protected, if they will be able to travel, to live a normal life. This is what they care about. And they know that this process is key in them realizing what they want, and that they know that the delay is causing them harm and also delaying key decisions in their lives. But they don't know how to interact with it, not because lack of knowledge, but also lack of platforms for the public to interact with it. We were talking about if there are platforms and if there are Yemenis doing work on engagement with the peace process, but I cannot think of one thing. Maybe there are, but it's not like when I was in Syria, and there are communities of Syrians in Washington, D.C., in other countries, and they are advocating. But in Yemen, I do know about here and there of like different people doing podcasting, having their organizations, but I don't know of organized movements of Yemenis interacting with the peace process, because it's not even that the public cannot interact, it's sometimes even parts to the peace process are not being engaged with it. So that's also another challenge. What did we want to say here as well? I don't remember. I really don't remember.
Well, I guess the question is, do we want to sum up where things stand? I feel like we already kind of did that at the beginning.
Yeah. I feel like I do wanna this point on lack of transparency. Okay. Yeah. It's already been covered, I feel like, but
Yeah, I would agree.
yeah.
Okay.
So maybe you move to the the war, the status of the war.
Yeah. Where are you? Status of the talks to end the war?
Yes.
Okay. Um, so maybe I can just give a quick overview of what's going on here, right? So let me find my notes. So maybe just to recap, I think there have been a couple of options that have been thrown on the table, and many of these options have real impacts for Yemenis and the future of the humanitarian crisis, and of course the future of the country. On the one hand, what we've seen are some really pragmatic solutions that have been put forward, right, which are often temporary, open-ended attempts to cease hostilities, ceasefire, which has been used, of course, over various times in the conflict to serve as an entry point for broader negotiations around economic measures, the lifting of the blockades, the reopening of the Hodeidah port, for instance, in 2018, the enabling of humanitarian corridors, all as confidence building measures is in an effort to resume broader peace conversations. But what we know, of course, from other contexts too, is that these are not very long lasting and don't often translate to a more serious, comprehensive peace agreement. And I think we can look to Gaza as one very recent example of that. We've also seen proposals, right, that speak to issues of power sharing and reintegration in a unified state. And that comes with certain demands around institutional reforms, security and military unification, as we've seen outlined in the Riyadh Agreement, all in the spirit of trying to manage north-south divisions and still enable for some form of a unified state. And then, of course, there are other options that have been floated that speak more to either full Southern autonomy or succession along the lines of a real official North-South solution that goes back to some of those pre-1990 divisions that we described in previous episodes, excuse me, or more of a federalized or decentralized model, right, which requires levels of compromise between the North and the South around politics, around governance measures more broadly and rule of law, and on the economy that still enable some form of cooperation, interaction, and unity, but recognize that certain systems and structures need to be distinct in order to enable a more peaceful future. And I think all of these options are important to understand in the current context, because what we've seen is as a real stalling of diplomatic momentum and investment in reaching the finish line on any of these options because of some really deeply rooted grievances that have yet to be unresolved. And some deeply rooted grievances that have yet to be resolved. And when we look ahead, Noor, I think there's a couple things just to think about in terms of what's required moving forward, right? And one is a doubling down of diplomatic efforts to get back to the negotiating table, especially in light of some of the reduction in tensions that we've seen around the Red Sea in light of the Gaza ceasefire. I think a second point is around really exploring how some of the track two initiatives, the more locally led, mediated efforts in the margins can be reinforced and can connect with the more high level, elite driven processes that have broken down. And then I think a third area that'd be great to get your reaction to is sustaining humanitarian and development assistance, and how, irrespective of which of these options takes root, the support that's required to accompany Yemenis in meeting their basic needs is more important than ever. And with Yemen not in the spotlight, there's a real risk that we could see some of that reduced and affect lives and livelihoods as a result.
Totally agree, because we have to continue to remind ourselves that Yemen experienced large displacement, protracted displacement. There are millions who moved multiple times, who are unable to go back to their areas of origin. And these people need assistance in order to survive in where they are now or in where they will be in the future. When I was in Yemen, we were running a study on barriers to return. So there is no active conflict. You don't see so much news on exchange of fire or conflict in Yemen. But why these people remain displaced? Because so many reasons. We found some of them are not really sure how they are perceived in their area of origin now. Will they be safe for them to go back? Are their houses safe? Will there be landmines? They lost their livestock? They lost their houses? Are there basic services? I'm here, maybe there is a school in this camp there. I'm not sure the school is there operational. So there are multiple barriers, from access to assets, to safety, to acceptance, to basic services, as I said, livelihood opportunities as well. And these need to be responded to in order for Yemenis to be able to survive. If we cut that assistance, even if the solution is people go back to their areas of origin, as I just said, might be not safe for them. They've lost already their houses there. Somebody else took it maybe. It's all completely destroyed. There are no basic services. How do you expect people to survive in these conditions? Many of them have called the new place home. They know they cannot go back there because they were part of the conflict in their area. They engaged in arm exchange. It's not safe for them to go back. What happens to these people? So there are different cases, profiles of Yemenis in Yemen, and their level of engagement in the conflict, the level of loss that they experienced, and their ability to recover. And you cannot just say this one programming or this one set of assistance can apply to all. You have to tailor it, and will take time. But it's not only humanitarian assistance that would help these people maintain survival. They really need recovery programming for those who wants to remain where they are, who wants assistance to go back to their areas of origin and rebuild their houses or rebuild the schools in there. You need recovery programming. But you also mostly need for the Yemen economy to rebuild itself. So these people can get jobs. They can work in the private and public sector. So there are layers of needs and layers of response that needs to be provided to Yemenis in order for them to be able to engage in the future of their decision in an active way. So far, they've been passive, not by choice, because they are in need for that assistance. One example I actually wanted to share. Should I share the example of the private sector here or later? maybe later. Here?
I think it's good here.
Yeah. So one example I could share here, when we were working in Yemen as advocacy colleagues trying to raise awareness on the needs in Yemen, the access issues, the economic barriers. Private sector company, large company in Yemen, reached out to us and said, "We have similar messages. We want to see similar change. So maybe we should join forces." And that was for me indicative of how challenging it is for not only the humanitarian sector, but even the private sector. These are not small sectors in Yemen, these are big sectors in Yemen. But for these two sectors, how challenging it is for us to actually engage on these issues. So we need to join forces. It's not an easy context. And throughout this episode, I kept reminding myself I need to be careful with terminologies. I need to be sensitive with certain issues, because it's in not a very easy context. There are different sides to it. There are different terminologies you have to, like, you cannot use a certain word to describe a group in the north, but you shouldn't use the other word to describe them in the south. So how do you maintain balance and also independence? It's just very challenging as a context. And the example of large company wanting the aid sector to help join forces to talk on these issues, it just shows you how difficult it is for us to find channels and to express these realities and ask for facilitation and support.
Your point on the private sector is a really critical one, because I think it's often a stakeholder that's not very well understood by the humanitarian community, and where there's very rarely interaction with the private sector, with the extent of relying on them as service providers in certain ways, right? To provide certain materials or equipment that we might procure for certain activities, or them providing services such as transport or water delivery or sanitation, right? But I think in a context like Yemen, where, as we've described in previous episodes, the economy is so both hampered by and connected to some of the conflict dynamics, it would be silly for us to not see their role and to find forms of engaging and having dialogue with them. I also share your discomfort with how this conversation is playing out, because I think we're two humanitarians who really try to embody the humanitarian principles in what we do. And that can lead to tension around being neutral and being independent, and the degree to which we can be invested in what are ultimately very political processes to end a war, right? And I think that's perhaps why we've struggled a little bit to navigate this conversation today. But I think it's also because we've worked in several contexts where the absence of a political solution has been central to our mission, but also crucial to the future status of the country and to the people that we have sought to serve. And it's a reality that I think is elusive in so many of the places where we work, including for a long time in Iraq, right? Where even when there's a reduction in violence, we don't often see a positive peace, as they say. So I think it's a conversation that at least I hope Yemen can continue to benefit from, as the international community hopefully re-engages in different ways over the coming months.
And I really hope that the international community and Yemenis among themselves try to speed up the reaching a solution for the crisis. Personally, I was very excited to go to Yemen and to help and be part of the response there. but I didn't stay more than a year. And there was multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is I was going through the handover notes, not only from the person before me, but the person before them and the person before them. And I go through the issues, I go through the documents, and it's very similar issues, like food programming cuts, US sanctioning, climate shocks, flood, droughts, detention, economy crisis, landmine, migrants, peace process. So many similarities. And it made me think, can I actually be part of a solution? And where, because I was so ambitious, it's like maybe I can help, but it's like things are not changing that much. Maybe I can come back in the future where things are being resolved. So in my last week in Yemen, I went out with a colleague to buy fabric to make my Yemeni dress before I leave because I really love the dresses there. And she took me around and then she asked me, so what are your plans and all of this? And then she told me, why are you leaving Yemen? You didn't like it? And I told her, no, I loved it, but I feel, and I'm really sorry to say this to you, I feel like if I leave now and come back in 5 years, it might be the same issues that I have to deal with. Might be the same situation. And she said, no, don't be sorry. This is what we think as well. It was sad to see a young woman who's super ambitious, hardworking, thinks that things might not change in her country. So she has to be independent and work hard to find opportunities. Many of the people in Yemen try to find opportunities outside of their country. And it's a young country. The majority are young people. And many of them thinking, I will find a job somewhere. I'll work on myself. I'll get a degree from another country. Because they don't see things moving forward. They don't see themselves investing in their country. And it's very sad. And I really hope that it doesn't take me 5 years to go into Yemen and deal with different issues. I really hope that it happens sooner. And I really would love to go back to Yemen. I loved Yemen. But still I cannot find, like, my brain cannot think of a solution, or I just don't see it happening. And I really hope that something happens or somebody change that for me. It's really, yeah, it's not really easy thing to say, but it's the unfortunate situation of Yemen.
So there are a few points that really struck me in our conversation today, Noor, and I think the first one is around this question of Yemen being stuck and the situation being one of stagnation, and that in many ways the status quo serves a number of different domestic and international interests that will continue to drive the direction of travel for the next couple of months, but also have the potential to be harnessed differently for forms of peace. But that as long as a more longer term solution to the conflict is not found, the humanitarian needs that we've described and the ongoing protracted displacement crisis will continue, and we're unlikely to expect to see large scale recovery, reconstruction, and a thriving Yemen that many of us wish to see. A second powerful message that's come from what you've shared today is that how peace pursued. A second powerful message that's emanated from what you've shared today is around how peace is pursued and that how it's pursued matters. That includes who's involved, who leads the process, who has legitimacy or perceived legitimacy to lead the process, and what options that might unlock and be perceived as tenable in the future, involving Yemenis from all aspects of society and doing the best that we can to really center their vision or oftentimes competing visions for the future. and how that is then balanced against interests that might be driven from external forces, whether within the region itself or beyond. And it's very hard, as we know and as we've heard, for Yemenis themselves. It's very hard, as we've heard, for Yemenis themselves to follow the peace process and to find a place in it. And that's something that needs to change. And then I think a last point in what you've shared is that the longer this crisis goes unresolved, the harder it will get for Yemenis and the harder it will be for them to rebuild, and the harder it will be for those of us who are part of the humanitarian community to contribute to that process effectively. And this will have significant impacts on future generations, including a generation of which that has only known Yemen in a context of war. I think the question this also leaves us with is whether we can find hope for the future of Yemen, and what will it take to invest in a process that is stronger than the ones we've seen so far.
Yemen, from my point of view, Yemen has big hope in the future because Yemen has the foundations to recover from this and do better, and for Yemenis to live good lives. Yemen has economic foundations, cultural foundations, environmental foundations. They even have some of the best people I met, and like people who care about their country, people who lived up. So, like in Syria, many people went outside of the country because of the crisis. They had to leave the country to protect their lives, and now they are being seen as an asset. They could help rebuilding the country. Similar case in Yemen. There are many Yemenis outside the country who've been contributing to the rest of the world and contribute to their country. As we said, very young population, young mind, not young spirits can help this country rebuild itself. There has been engagement in a peace process, which means there is some will in realizing peace in Yemen, and that's by itself something foundational to that hope. And Yemen, we talked about it, it's a very beautiful country. They have things that the world wants to see, and realizing peace will help the country to open up to the rest of the world, and interact with the culture and what this country can offer to us all. So that, for me, is major reason to also be not only hopeful, but to be looking forward for the Yemen we want to see, because it's going to be good for everyone, not only for Yemenis. So yeah, I think this can be this hope. Sorry, I just again mumbled. Okay, I think I'll cut. I've said something at some point, I'll cut it. Okay, okay. So, do you want to say this in this season did one thing we hope it made you feel? Do you
Yeah,
want to end it? Yeah,
I can do that part. And then you do thank you.
yes.
Okay. So if this series did one thing, we hope it made Yemen feel a little bit less like an abstract crisis and a bit more like a place full of people, contradictions, and possibilities.
Thank you for listening to Confused About Yemen. If this conversation moved you, we invite you to follow Yemeni journalists, researchers, activists, center their voices, not just ours, and we hope you will join our next season. We will take another context and try to simplify. No, sorry, I'll just cut this. Okay, next season. خلاص. Thank you for listening, and we hope we. I just also said that. Sorry, خلاص, it's done. It's repetition. Okay.
No problem. Do you want to do it again? That part?
Yeah.
Or are you okay?
Yes, I'll just do the whole thing without these two parts. Okay. Thank you for listening to Confused About Yemen. If this conversation moved you, we invite you to follow Yemeni journalists, researchers, and activists. Center their voices, not just ours, and we hope you join our next season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Done. Okay, let me stop the recording.